In 2010, director David Yates gave the world a lonely penultimate entry into a fabled cinematic saga.
In 2021, we keep the theme of new beginnings going with our first ever Welsh whiskey.
The film is Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 1.
The whiskey is Penderyn Madeira finish.
And we'll review them both. This is
the Film and Whiskey Podcast. Welcome to the Film and Whiskey Podcast, where each week we review a classic movie and a glass of whiskey. I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And this week we are kicking off season number 5. Brad, can you believe we're in the 5th season already?
Bro, I am just amazed that we've made it mostly out of this pandemic, let alone 3 years into a podcast.
I do love how our seasons are kind of like seasons of the show Survivor, where, it's not really a year long. Like, that show's been on for 20 years, but they're in season 48,
Yeah, 41, actually. Right now, I think Danny is my favorite. He's a front runner for me.
Do you actually watch Survivor?
Bob, I'm actually watching it right now.
We found the one thing that Brad keeps up with. Wow, man, good for you.
Dude, I am so far removed from culture. It's not even funny. I just got a smartphone 2 years ago,
Brad,
I think.
Believe me, we know. We know how far this podcast is testament to that, my friend.
So yeah, man, the one part of culture I keep up with is a TV show that's 20 years old.
And a movie that's 11 years old. Today we're talking about Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, Part 1.
Stupid elf! You could have killed me!
Dobby never meant to kill. Dobby only meant to maim or seriously injure.
How dare you take a witch's wand! How dare you defy your masters!
Dobby has no master. Dobby is a free elf, and Dobby has come to save Harry Potter and his friends.
This is, if I had to pinpoint one of the Harry Potter films that I think kind of carries a reputation for being a lesser entry, it would be this one. We both established that we think Order of the Phoenix might be the worst movie in this series. I think the general population would either pinpoint this movie or Chamber of Secrets as being the worst one. And for that reason, I've actually been really excited to talk about this movie because, good or bad, whether you like it or not, I have to say, I think this might be the most unique entry in the whole Harry Potter series.
Yeah, Bob, I personally, coming into this, was kind of thinking the same thing. I've always known that a lot of my friends, I feel like the general public, doesn't care for this movie quite as much. They would, in general, seem to prefer the final movie over it. And for me, I've always really liked episode 7 in the Harry Potter saga.
Episode 7. I love it.
Yeah. I've always really liked this entry, and watching it for the podcast just confirmed it for me. I would probably put this as one of my top 3 of the whole franchise.
Yeah, it's a really interesting movie, isn't it? Because I feel like I can understand why people don't like it. It has a very different vibe. It has a really different rhythm than the rest of the movies. And it doesn't, the 7th book, from what I understand, because I haven't read it, but just seeing the movies, I know that it's a departure. It doesn't follow the academic school year the way that all the other books do. And, that's always one of those funny things to joke about. Why does Voldemort always wait until the end of spring semester to pull off his big thing? Well, this time around, they're not in school. They're off hunting for these Horcruxes. And even though it kind of does follow the same seasonal calendar, you don't have those moments that you always fall back on in the other movies of, all right, now it's time for a Quidditch match, or now it's time to see Hogwarts decked out for Christmas. Like you said in your intro here, it's a really lonely movie. You're just following these characters as the emotional weight of this journey is starting to weigh down on them. And in a lot of ways, Brad, it reminded me of the last movie we watched for this show, which is Return of the King. I feel like if there is one entry in the Harry Potter universe that really focuses on the toll that this is taking on its characters, it's this movie.
Yeah, I think that you see it from the very start. Like, they open this movie with a freaking punch. Like, Hermione obliviating her memory from her parents is heart-wrenching.
Yeah.
Like you just know from the very get-go of this film, you know, from the very opening shot of Bill Nye. Sorry, is it Nighy?
You know,
Nighy?
I don't know if he says Nighy or just Nye. And it's so weird because, you know, in America, we think of Bill Nye as a very different person. But
right.
He is a well-known British actor. However you want to pronounce it, Brad, I'll roll with it.
Should we call him Bill Nye the octopus guy?
Bill Nye the actor guy?
Yeah, there we go. So like from that opening scene with Bill Nye, like just straight up in his eyes, to Hermione destroying, you know, the memory of her existence from her parents, all the way to that. I think the scene that really did it for me is when they go into Grimmauld Place and the specter of Dumbledore kind of charges at them. And then she casts a spell to detect if there's anybody else in the house. And she says, as the camera like pulls away from her in the hallway and fades to black, you hear Hermione saying, "We're all alone."
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that line is just so daggone brilliant because she is saying it in a good sense, like we're all alone, there's nobody here to catch us, but you can hear that tinge of sadness in her voice of like, we're all alone, there's no one here to help us. That sets the tone for this entire movie, and I'm in. I love it. I think David Yates knocks this one out of the park.
I have so many things I want to say. Like, Brad, I have to be honest here. I don't think this is the best Harry Potter movie, but I'm probably more excited to talk about this one than I have been in a long, long time. And I think it's just because this is maybe the least talked about of all the movies. And I think it really deserves more discussion than it gets. But we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves here. We need to jump into Brad Explains. This is the part of the podcast where Brad breaks down the movie that he has just seen, often for the first time. Brad, I think we need to carry over the strict 60-second limit that we implemented last season because, man, we were able to just fly through Brad Explains last season.
Yeah, it's kind of nice to get through it real quick. I've set some pretty amazing records with Brad Explains. Most notably, I think, was Gone with the Wind, which lasted a full 600 seconds.
It was nearly as long as the film itself, as I recall.
I mean, that's the goal every week, right?
All right, man. Can you break down the plot of this movie in 60 seconds or less?
I think I can. Voldemort and his cronies kill the Minister of Magic, pretty much take over the wizarding world, sending Harry, Ron, and Hermione on the run. They do not return to Hogwarts, but instead they continue Dumbledore's search for the Horcruxes. Not only do they have to find these Horcruxes, but they also have to find a way to destroy them because they are nearly invulnerable. They realize that the Sword of Gryffindor can do this. They invade the Ministry of Magic to steal a locket, which is Salazar Slytherin's locket from Dolores Umbridge, which they succeed at. Ron, in the words of all our British friends, is an enormous git. He's probably the worst character of the movie. Of all the movies, we hate Ron. Ron is the worst. But he finally comes back to help them after running off like a little baby. And they destroy some Horcruxes, and they escape some Snatchers, and Dobby dies, and Hedwig dies.
1 second. You did
sad,
it.
Man.
You did it in 59 seconds. Look at that.
Dude, I'm on point, bro.
That was perfectly timed,
This is a new season, man.
You're a new man.
I'm going to go 59 seconds every single week.
All right, Brad, there are a number of directions we can go, but I think that you've kind of already tipped off where this naturally needs to go. And that is in talking...
Ron is the worst.
He's a git.
But don't expect me to be grateful just because now there's another damn thing we've got to find.
I thought you knew what you signed up for.
Yeah, I thought I did too.
Well, I'm sorry, but I don't quite understand. What part of this isn't living up to your expectations? Did you think we were going to be staying in a 5-star hotel, finding a Horcrux every other day? You thought you'd be back with your mum by Christmas?
I just thought, after all this time, we would have actually achieved something. I thought you knew what you were doing. I thought Dumbledore would have told you something worthwhile. I thought you had a plan.
I told you everything Dumbledore told me. And in case you haven't noticed, we have found a Horcrux already.
Yeah, and we're about as close to getting rid of it as we are to finding the rest of them, aren't we?
He's a git.
But no, seriously, I think that we always talk about performances on this show, and I think that the performance that I want to talk about the most is Hermione, Emma Watson, because we've talked about how Emma Watson is kind of up and down throughout the series, the same way that Daniel Radcliffe is kind of up and down throughout the series. But if this movie belongs to one character, this is really Hermione's movie. Watching David Yates leave the camera on Emma Watson and letting her just kind of go to work, she's like revelatory in this movie. Where was this person in some of these other movies? She is absolutely phenomenal. And I don't just mean she's phenomenal for like an Emma Watson performance, which sounds insulting, but like if you've seen some of these other Harry Potter movies, she can be downright wooden at times. And in this movie, oh my gosh, man, the level of emotion that she is constantly conveying is just next level. She's so good, Brad.
Yeah, and I think she also kind of dives back into what makes Hermione Granger a unique fictional character. Like, you really get her not just being emotional and really like drawing the group together, keeping them focused, keeping them moving forward. She also draws back into like what makes her her. She studies a lot. She is intellectual. She has a way of explaining things that is just brilliant. And so I think that the writers and David Yates really just tacked into what makes Hermione Granger a great character. And Emma Watson, like you said, Bob, her performance in this movie is fantastic. Without her really stepping up her game, I think I might be in the camp with a lot of other people that don't care for this movie as much. But as it is, I'm with you, man. She is out of this world.
Well, and I touched on this a little bit just a moment ago, but I talked about the rhythm of the movie. And I think that we can definitely get into the filmmaking aspects and how this movie feels different just from a pacing and directorial point of view. But the decision to split the final book into two movies was kind of momentous at the time. This hadn't really been done before. This was done, well before Twilight or The Hunger Games did it. And a lot of people saw it as kind of a cash grab. And I think if we're being honest here, it kind of is a cash grab. But I think this is one of those rare instances where splitting a final book into two parts for the film really, really works. On paper, how much plot is there in this movie compared to other Harry Potter movies? Like, there's definitely less. But because of that, I think this movie feels very relaxed to me. Even though there's like a tension building throughout, like you really get the sense of the slog that they're going through on a day-to-day basis. And because they need to kind of fill the runtime here, they build in like emotional outlets for these characters that they usually don't have time for in these movies. And it really helps, I think, the series overall. And I think it comes out most of all in the performances. Like, Emma Watson is given some breathing room to kind of do what she does best as an actress. I even noticed it with Rupert Grint as Ron. The scene where he comes back after his long absence in the movie, and he's describing this incredible like spiritual experience he had of being led back to Harry and Hermione. It's the best acting that Ron does in the entire series. And it's because I kind of noticed as an actor, he needs to operate at kind of a different rhythm than the plot of these movies often allows him to do. And so the fact that this movie is kind of shaggy and is kind of slower paced, I think actually really benefits the performances and it benefits the series overall.
Yeah, and the other thing I really love about this film is that it continues the pattern set in The Half-Blood Prince that David Yates just wants to explore. What does it mean for these three children to be best friends? And you have that in so many little moments, like when Harry and Ron, right after the spiritual moment you're just describing, Bob, when Harry, Ron is, asking like, well, when is Hermione not going to be mad at me? And Harry goes, oh, just keep talking about that little ball of light that entered your heart. And I think she'll be okay. Like, little moments like that are kind of peppered throughout the movie. And they're heartwarming. They remind you that these are just 17-year-olds that in the midst of fighting the evil dark lord of darkness and doom and death and sadness, they're just kids. They like each other. They're trying to be friends. They're trying to support each other as best as they know how. Mm-hmm. And I think that they really continue where they left off with that. From the sixth movie into the seventh.
Well, and I think the sixth and seventh movies are really in kind of prime position when we think about the overarching story of Harry Potter. And we talked about this with Lord of the Rings, how we both loved the Two Towers because there's something about that kind of middle chapter where hope seems lost and maybe your heroes win a small victory, but there's still like that doom and gloom that's hanging over everything. And it carries a sense of tension into the last chapter. And that is really at play here. You had it at the end of the sixth movie when Dumbledore dies, and you have it in this movie where I think the perfect kind of encapsulation of the tone of this movie is, Ron has abandoned Harry and Hermione. Harry and Hermione are alone, and Harry turns on the radio and there's a song on, and he just walks over to Hermione, who's been crying for days and days. And they just start dancing, and they have this really great scene where, they're twisting and turning, and they finally start laughing. And it's this really brief moment of joy in an otherwise really kind of sullen movie. And it's a reminder that they are fighting for something. You know what I mean? Like that what Voldemort is ultimately fighting for is empty and hollow. And even though it's really hard to see right now, like the love that these characters have for each other is what's going to continue to carry them forward. And then as soon as that kind of joyous realization hits, they kind of go back to being sullen again, because I think the weight of everything hits them. And, again, like they're kind of toying with this will they, won't they thing with Harry and Hermione. Like, are they going to ultimately become a couple, or is it not going to work? And there's that at play too, where they don't want to let themselves, kiss each other. And it just kind of falls back into, oh yeah, and we're getting chased by the Dark Lord. And it ends in silence, and they just kind of walk away from each other. And I think that allowing the scenes of this movie to kind of end in that fashion, like the rest of the series wouldn't do anything like that. You know what I mean? Like there'd always be a quippy one-liner or something to end a scene, even as recently as the sixth movie. And this time around, they're just kind of like, no, like we're going to let this thing breathe. We're going to give it the room that it needs, because I think to have the emotional impact it needs to have, we can't be moving at a lightning pace here.
Yeah, and I think that it really is the pacing that does it for me in this movie. That with all the performances that are great, with the bits of action that kind of open the movie, once you get to that scene where Harry, Ron, and Hermione are in Grimmauld Place, Hermione says, we're alone. From there on out till nearly the end of the film, it is a slow-paced, relaxed movie that has tension at every moment of the way. Mm-hmm. You're always nervous about them being caught. You're always nervous about them making a misstep, which by the end of the movie, they do. Yeah. They have made a misstep. I think the other thing that really got me about this movie is like, I know it must be easy to be in like Europe and like Scotland and some of the places in England and just like set up a really nice high-end camera and just take beautiful vistas, right? Like I'm pretty sure I could have shot a few of those shots and it would have turned out great because the landscape's just so daggone beautiful.
Right.
But holy cow, did they take their time with the cinematography and choosing the right shots to display how lonely these characters were. Like you just get these wide sweeping vistas and you just see Harry, Ron, and Hermione or their tent or something about them just teeny tiny, like off in the distance. And I loved that, dude.
And yet, weirdly, this one has the least kind of cinematic feel to it. Does that make sense? Like, the first two movies, you get the vibe that these were filmed on like a soundstage. And then, the next few movies, it's much more quirky and you've got your Alfonso Cuarón kind of thing going on. But even in the sixth movie, it has this kind of like veneer or like, gloss of Hollywood to it This movie, like, it's a new cinematographer, and it looks like an indie drama. Like, it reminded me of the way that Spike Jonze shot Where the Wild Things Are. Like, it's kind of shaky cam and a lot of handheld stuff. The color palette is very naturalistic, to the point where you kind of sometimes forget that you're watching a movie about magic people. Like, and then all of a sudden you just notice that, oh yeah, Daniel Radcliffe has a wand in his hand and he can cast spells too. Like, in all the other movies, whenever somebody would go to do a spell, the camera would pull back or it would pull up into a crane shot, and it would very much emphasize like the magical nature of what was going on. And in this one, it just feels much more grounded. It feels much more real. And like I said, it feels almost like an indie movie where characters are just kind of happen to be shooting each other with all these spells all the time. I really love that they leaned into that. And you notice it like towards the end of the movie when they're getting chased through the woods by, what are they called? Snatchers or something. And you know, like the shutter speed of the film stock they're using changes to the point where it looks like Saving Private Ryan. Like, it's a very different look that this series to this point had not leaned into yet. But I think it really works for the story they're trying to tell here.
Yeah, I mean, even at the start of the film, they spend a lot of time in London, you know, kind of wandering around, figuring out where to go, spending time in a cafe, ordering cappuccinos at a really dingy diner, which maybe that's a thing you do in Britain. I don't know. But like they spend so much time in London at the start, and they're just in like their nice clothes, and they just feel like they are fully immersed in the normal human world. Mm-hmm. And I will say, like, that was something that for me, the first time I watched the movies was a little bit jarring. Like, Bob, I know you didn't read all the books, but for me, getting into the movies, it was strange to think about the fact that this was, and I know that this might sound dumb, but it's almost strange to think about this fact that Harry Potter was set in the real world sometimes. Mm-hmm. And the movies really hammer that home, that they are in London. They're, you know, drinking coffee at a diner. They're getting on the subway. Yeah. They're facing traffic. Like, that was like hammered home in the movies in a way that I don't think they do in the books. And in this film in particular, I think it really adds to the drama, adds to the weight of what they're doing in fighting Voldemort.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And, you know, I've just been kind of thinking about this as you've been talking. I don't know that there's ever been a recurring film series, you know, outside of like the MCU, but like, you know, one IP where each entry into that saga is so tonally different than the last. Like the two Chris Columbus movies, into Alfonso Cuarón, into Mike Newell, and then into 5, 6, 7 of Harry Potter. Each movie really strikes a completely different tone, and a lot of times it's different visually. And I think you're right, Brad. You know, aside from maybe that kind of jarring transition from Chamber of Secrets to Prisoner of Azkaban, the transition here to like what they're trying to present visually and even, you know, thematically and pacing wise, it really is a jarring shift. And I think that, like we said, for a lot of people, this one stands out. It really does stick out like a sore thumb in a way that I think a lot of people haven't really been able to kind of embrace it and grasp it. But especially on rewatch, this one holds up really, really well, for me at least.
Well, and I can only imagine like trying to watch all of these in like a month or something.
Yeah.
But for me, watching them through 2 at a time, I think that this is a refreshing change for the franchise. Mm-hmm. And honestly, I felt that way when I read the Deathly Hallows. You know, I know some people who didn't care for the final book quite as much because it's vastly different than the other books. You don't go to Hogwarts until the end of the book. You don't see them interacting with professors and classes and, you know, fighting with Snape over potions homework. And it's just vastly different than the rest of the series. And so, yeah, the tonal shift from 6 to 7 just makes sense to me. And I love it. I really, truly think that David Yates hit his stride in the 6th movie and is just skating on a beautiful ice in this 7th movie.
Now, before we heap too much praise on it, I don't think this is a perfect movie, Brad, and I don't know if you're with me, but I do think this is probably about 15 to 20 minutes too long. I think there are a few moments where yes, like we understand the rhythm. We understand that this is a slog for the characters, but you're kind of making it a slog for me too. You know, when they venture to, is it called Godric's Hollow, or, you know, where Harry was born? That sequence is way too extended for me. There were way too many times where, you know, they enter a building and they're trying to build the suspense. So there are long silent periods. And like the third or fourth time they do that, I'm thinking to myself, okay, like you got me 3 times. You're not going to get me again. You know, do you know what I mean? So there are certain things about this movie that I think could have been tightened up a little bit. I don't think it's the best one in the series, but I'm with you in that I do think this is an underrated movie, both for the quality of the movie and also for the purpose that it serves, you know, for the saga overall.
Well, I really think that the most important thing we do then, Bob, is in order to really get ready to bring out the terrible things about this film, we need to drink some whiskey.
I think that's correct, Brad. What do you say we try this Penderyn?
I believe it's pronounced Penderyn.
It's not. Let's try it.
Okay. Yeah, let's do it, Bob.
All right, so today we are checking out Penderyn. This is a brand that we're going to be featuring for the next 3 weeks on the podcast. I reached out to the Penderyn people on Instagram because I found out that this is a whiskey that's made in Wales. And when was the last time, Brad, that you heard of a Welsh whiskey?
About 10 minutes ago when you told me it was a Welsh whiskey.
Yeah, exactly. So I was like, oh my gosh, like we'd love to feature a new country for us on the podcast, and they were absolutely down for it. They sent us 3 beautiful bottles to sample. I cannot wait to get through all these. Penderyn has a really interesting history. Like, it's only been in existence since the early 2000s, but at that time, it was the only distillery in operation, commercially available whiskey in Wales. Wales at one time had been a pretty major distilling center, just like Ireland or Scotland, but in the early 20th century, that really just declined to the point where they were not known for making whiskey at all. But Penderyn is really leading, you know, the return, the charge back into the market for Welsh whiskey. Now, Brad, the interesting thing here is, like, you know, in terms of like the terrain, I imagine it's closer to Scotland, but in terms of their distilling process and how they mature their whiskey in barrels, it's closer to Irish whiskey because they like to use ex-bourbon barrels to mature their whiskey. So that's really similar to what we get with Irish whiskey. And this particular one is then finished in Madeira casks. Now, Madeira is a type of fortified wine, so we're going to get some of that kind of like sherry port kind of thing we might get on scotches in this as well. I'm really looking forward to trying this, Brad, and if the nose is any indication, like, we're in for something really, really good here.
Yeah, I was going to say, I am getting honey and graham cracker and melon and a little bit of a kind of a grapey, you know, I think you're getting a little bit of that Madeira finish on there. I really like this nose a lot. It has a lot of interesting notes going on. It is bright and intriguing. I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10 on the nose.
When I first popped the cork on this bottle, the overwhelming smell that I got, I mean, the smell wasn't overwhelming, but like the note that I got more than anything was bubblegum, like classic pink bubblegum. And I was like, wow, I have never had something like that on a whiskey from this area of the world before. And I think that has kind of calmed down a little bit since I've opened the bottle. But you're right, Brad, these notes of melon and honey, it's a little bit herbal, but not very much. It's like a very soft scotch to me. I'm hoping, at least, that it's going to be in that kind of sweeter realm as well. I really like this a lot. I'm with you, man. I'm going to give it an 8 on the nose.
Yeah, and that just jumps us into our taste. For me, you get a lot of that malt that comes through here on the palate. But then I'm getting honey. There's some really nice, soft, spicy notes going on here, like a little bit of baking spices. There's a little bit of floral stuff going on here. I'm going to go back to my note of it's just bright. It's really, really nice. And you're right. It reminds me of an Irish whiskey, but with a kick of something special. I think I'll give it an 8.5 out of 10 on the taste.
Yeah, this is like really kind of towing the line in the best way possible between the Irish and Scotch worlds for me. It has the sweetness and the brightness of an Irish whiskey. You're right, it's honey sweet. I think the bourbon barrels, like you can really kind of sense them here, Brad. I got a lot of cinnamon on the flavor, but then again, you get that kind of grapey, raisiny thing that I think is coming from that Madeira finish, and it stays in that kind of very light, malty realm you get from, some of the lighter scotches that we have. I think I would give this to somebody who is new to the world of just European whiskey in general. Like, this is a great entry point into obviously Welsh whiskey, but if you're not used to drinking Irish whiskey, this is a great place to start. If you're not used to drinking Scotch, this is a great place to start. It's the best of both worlds. I'm going to give it an 8.5 on the flavor.
Yeah, and that brings us to our finish. For me, it is smooth. It's a little bit stronger than I would expect. This is sitting at 92 proof, which I really didn't expect to have quite the punch it would at the end. But it's just got this beautiful warmth that just sits on my throat for quite a while. Mm-hmm. So I really like this finish. I will say that there's nothing complex about it. I'm not getting a lot of flavor notes on the finish that I was kind of hoping for, but it's still really solid. I'll give it an 8 out of 10 on the finish.
I'm actually going to give it an 8 as well. And I'm with you. I think this drink's a little bit hotter than 92 proof, but not in like a chest burn kind of way. It doesn't hug you going down. It's a little bit more prickly on the palate than I was expecting. But I think that kind of manifests as spices, and you talked about it being a little bit spicy on the flavor as well. So if you like a little bit of heat, on the palate, I think this is the way to go. I'm going to give it an 8 on the finish. And then when we get into balance, Brad, I think sometimes we ding whiskeys that don't have like a robust kind of punch to them. But that's not what this whiskey is. This is a much softer, more mild whiskey that introduces some really subtle and complex flavors as you go. And I like that a lot. And from nose to taste to finish, this really delivers. I think I'm going to give it a 9 out of 10 on the balance.
Bob, I think we're going to come out to the same score, man. 9 out of 10 for me as well.
All right.
Yeah, nothing different from you there. It's just a well-balanced whiskey.
Well, that takes us to the price. Now, again, this is a little bit pricier than what you would find for entry-level scotches. I also don't want to just call this an entry-level whiskey. This is their kind of flagship offering. But if you go to Penderyn's website, they have a ton of different expressions. But they're representative of a very, very small market in terms of Welsh whiskey. The importer that they use, I don't know how many different people they're working with in the States, but I imagine it can't be that many. So, to be able to acquire this is going to cost you a little bit more than a Johnny Walker who has tons of connections and is pumping out product at a ridiculous volume. So, Brad, I was surprised to find that they do sell this in the state of Ohio. I know you looked up the price. What's it selling for currently in Ohio?
$64.99.
All right, $64. So I think working in its favor is it's incredibly rare in terms of the part of the world that it's coming from. Working against it is the fact that it is a very mild whiskey. And I think a lot of times when people pay premium prices for whiskey, they want something that's really going to punch them. And that's not what this whiskey's going to do. I don't know. Where are you kind of coming out on the value here?
I think it is a solid value. I would honestly compare this to a Quinta Reuben. And the price of Quinta Reuben has gone up a little bit. If you've been with the podcast for any amount of time, you know that we rave about that scotch. The price right now in Ohio for that has moved from $52 when we started buying it to $58. So in my mind, this is right in the same range as a Quinta Reuben. I would say that this is a slightly lesser but comparable product. So I would put it at a 7.5 out of 10 on value. I think it is a solid value for what you're getting, which is a really beautiful entry into the world of European whiskey.
Yeah, I'm going to give it a 6.5 on value. I'm right there with you. It's a little bit pricier than I'd like it to be. If it was sub $60, I think it'd be a much higher score for me. But that still brings me out to a 40 out of 50. And I think if I've calculated yours correctly, Brad, are you at a 41?
Man, look at you doing math.
I'll tell you what, man, I've learned a lot in the off season here. So that's bringing us out to an 81 out of 100, or an average of a 40.5 out of 50. anything that goes over that 40 mark is usually an automatic yes from us. And it's going to be from me today. I think if you can find a bottle of this, it is well worth trying. And it's a really unique story of a whiskey to have on your shelf.
Yeah, it's a great offering. Whenever you have friends who have drank all the bourbons that there are to drink, get them something like this. Expand the horizons, jump into something new, and you can't do better than Penderyn Madeira.
All right, man. Well, let's carry this positive energy back into our episode where we are now going to dump on all the things wrong with Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 1. What do you say?
Time to dump. Well, that was Penderyn Madeira, a whiskey that Bob and I both are just impressed with. Honestly, Bob, I know we have more of it on the slate for the season, so I'm pumped to get to it.
Yeah, man, the next 2 weeks are going to be pretty delicious, if that was any indication.
Yeah, but we are back here talking about Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 1. You know, Bob, we spent a lot of time really gushing about the movie in the first half. For me, though, there's definitely aspects of this movie that are a little bit rough. And for me, this might be a personal thing, but I actually struggled with the way they portray Harry and Hermione's relationship in this. And the reason for that is because I desperately, and rightly so, believe that Harry and Hermione should have ended up together.
Mm-hmm.
J.K. Rowling herself tweeted it out at some point that she thinks that she made a mistake in putting Hermione and Ron together. So I know that I'm in the right here, but it almost feels like too much of a tease. The two of them like dancing together and hugging and having alone time where you can see that they genuinely deeply care for one another. Mm-hmm. And I will say, I'm not sitting here saying that men and women can't have deep relationships that are not romantically involved. Like, I have many female friends who I care very deeply for, but have no romantic interest in because I'm only romantically interested in my wife. That's great. But daggone it, Bob, I want Harry and Hermione together.
Well, your support for Harry and Hermione is well documented throughout all the episodes we've done. I agree with you. I do think that they probably knew their audience and they know the audience wants Harry and Hermione together and they're playing into that. Again, having not read the book, I'm going to just go ahead and assume that they were probably maybe embellishing a little bit and adding stuff to like milk it even further with the will they, won't they kind of thing. I don't know, man. I feel like I'm with you and I'm also not, because I do like that we see the maturity of both of these people, that there's this unspoken thing, but they don't act on it and they decide not to act on it. And I really like that. However, I think that teasing us as much as they did with what is very clearly an attraction between these two people, and to the point where Hermione even says, like, let's just stop. Like, let's just give up and stay here and grow old together. I was like, yes, yeah. I'll watch that. Like, yeah, I'll watch that movie.
I'm in.
Yeah, Voldemort can hunt you forever and you guys can just be in love. You know, I'm down with it. But to give us that and then never give us a verbal, like, we can't do this. I'm not saying they didn't make the right choice, and I know it would be kind of hokey, and it would be something we don't necessarily need, quote unquote, for them to say out loud their motivations. But if you're going to tease us that much, I feel like you almost need to give us a scene where they verbally say to each other, I like Ginny, I like Ron, we're not going to go any further with this. Because otherwise, it's like you're continuing to tantalize us into the 8th movie.
Bob, we've made it nearly 40 minutes into this episode, and you have finally mentioned Ginny. Man. I don't want to just dismiss the things that you just said, because I'm with you 100%. But can we just have like a quick funeral service for like any amount of acting talent that Bonnie Wright might have had at some point in her life?
Yeah, man. Once again, not great in this movie.
Yeah. Yeah, you know what she does, and I feel bad saying this because I know it's a movie you love, but I feel like she does what Julianne Moore does a ton in Children of Men. She just rushes her lines. Like she
does that in every movie too.
In every movie, there's no commas, there's no periods. Like she just rushes through her lines.
It's like ancient Greek.
Yeah. Yes. Oh man, the seminary jokes. Oh, if you've ever studied ancient Hebrew or Greek literature, you know what we're talking about.
You're rolling in the aisles right now.
Oh man,
it's a very niche joke, that one.
Oh man, yeah. I didn't want to talk about it for as long as possible, but Bonnie Wright is so bad. Why does Harry like her? Like, I know that the books are not the movies, but even in the books, I didn't totally get why he liked Ginny. But your imagination can come up with like an attractive female that Harry likes. But then you watch the movie and you're like, nope, Bonnie Wright, you can't act. I'm sorry.
Yeah, man, I don't even know where to go with that. I think we've said what we need to say about the character of Ginny. Brad, can I steer us in a different direction?
Oh, 100%. Let's get out of that. Let's get out of those waters.
Let's steer out of that skid here. All right. I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and I guess this is a good place to ask you about it. I've always wondered about how do you properly estimate a sequel and how good a sequel is? Because a sequel is necessarily, like, it doesn't have to pull the weight of whatever came before it. You know what I'm saying? Like, it always has the benefit of you don't have to reintroduce characters. You don't have to reintroduce, like, these certain plot points. They're just assumed. And I think a lot of times we give credit to sequels in a way that's like, yeah, but would you give credit to that if it wasn't based on something you've already seen? So, like, I think about a show like Better Call Saul, which is a really good TV show, but I think people have been saying for years now that it's the best thing on TV. And I'm like, I don't see that. And I think it's just the level of familiarity you have with Breaking Bad. And then when, like, a character from Breaking Bad shows up on the show, you go, oh, shit, it's that guy. You know what I mean? Like, it's the kind of fan servicey thing that you saw in the Star Wars sequels where, you know, fucking Chewbacca would show up and you'd be like, oh my God, it's Chewbacca. But
yeah, weird looking Chewbacca that doesn't even look like himself.
But like in the context of that story as like a standalone thing, Chewbacca showing up shouldn't be a big deal, but they're just playing on the fact that you know Chewbacca because you've seen this other thing. And I've always kind of wondered, like, do we give sequels too much credit when they're actually just relying on the work that all the other movies did before it? You know what I'm saying?
No, I'm right there with you, man. I think that the sign of a really good sequel is when they take the work done by the first movie or the first season of a television show or whatever iteration of a sequel you're talking about, is when they take the work done by the first part and deepen it exponentially. Like, in my mind, a really good first movie, like if you were like, I don't know, drawing out a story arc, I feel like you need almost a little bit of a rise in the first movie, and then it slowly dips towards like the depths, right? The dark part of the story. And then the second movie takes that and just nosedives, like you're going down the freaking Millennium Force. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, I mean, I guess I don't know where you're going with this in terms of Harry Potter, because, well, I guess, I don't know. Is a sequel only the second movie in a series? Is this a sequel?
I don't know. I've just been kind of thinking about it. And like, this might not even be the appropriate episode to have this conversation, but I think it's just something that we should keep in mind moving forward when we talk about sequel movies. Because I was thinking about Alan Rickman as Snape, and he's only in this movie very briefly. And of course, he plays a much bigger role in the final movie, which I'm going to spoil some stuff about right now. So if you don't want to hear that, skip ahead about 1 minute. But, you know, at the end of the 8th movie, we find out that Snape was a double agent all along and that he loved Lily so much and blah, blah, blah. And, you know, people go crazy about the Snape fan fiction and stuff, whatever. But I think the thing that always kind of bothered me about that subplot is I think it shows very clearly that J.K. Rowling was still working on these stories as they were being published. But like, Snape doesn't come across that way at all for like 6 of the 7 books. And then in the 7th book, it's like, oh, this was the plan the whole time. You guys just didn't see it. And like, even in this movie, there's that thing where Snape gets installed as headmaster of Hogwarts, and you hear about the fact that like students are being tortured by Death Eaters. And I understand that there's supposed to be this big ruse that they're all playing, and Snape has to play his part until his final sacrifice or whatever. But it's like, did you really think this through, J.K. Rowling? Or did you just like paint yourself in a corner and then you were like, no, Snape was a good guy the whole time? And I kind of think about that with things like this, where it's like, all right, you're going to give credit to the 8th movie for like this incredible reveal of Snape's true character. But like movies 1 through 7 don't really give any indication that that's the case.
Honestly, Bob, I think that the premise of what you're talking about can be true. I actually don't think it's true in this case.
Okay.
For me, reading through the books, watching the movies, I do think that they do at the very least, you might be right, but at the very least, they do a good job of explaining why Snape hates Harry so much throughout the books. That this idea that this is the child of the woman he desperately loved, sired by the man he desperately hated. Mm-hmm. And so with Harry's, seeming arrogance, with the way he plays Quidditch, with the way he's the hero, the center point of a lot of Hogwarts, drama and stories while Snape is a teacher there, it makes sense to me why Snape hated Harry so much and yet was still willing to sacrifice on his behalf in the end of all things.
I get that. This was probably a bad example. It just kind of got me thinking about it. And I'll probably bring it up again, like when we get to episode 3 of the Star Wars movies, when we do that this season, because, while I think that's the best of the prequels, I still don't think that it perfectly demonstrates like just what a tragedy it is to see Anakin become Darth Vader. And I think it's because they rely too much on the iconography of Darth Vader that you're already used to, instead of really diving deep into like creating the Darth Vader character in that movie. So we'll talk about it more when we get there. I think it's just something we need to be aware of when we watch sequel movies. Are we giving credit to the movie as it stands on its own, or are we crediting the movie when it's actually just standing on the shoulders of the movie that came before it? You know what I'm saying?
Oh, for sure. Honestly, for me, I don't even give a rip about that question anymore. I just want to know, what do you call middle movies in a like multi-movie cinematic universe? Like, are they all sequels? Are they just like forgotten middle children? I really need to know this answer now.
Yeah, I don't know. I think we should just call it the forgotten middle child.
Okay. I'm in, man.
The FMC.
The FMCs.
All right, man. We have talked at length about this movie. I think this is a really underrated film. I also think that we could get too far down the rabbit hole of hyping it up. Like, this is not a 10 out of 10 movie. I don't even think this is a 9 out of 10 movie. It works very well, but it is probably one of the lesser entries in the overall Harry Potter franchise, or at least it's like a middle chapter for me. I've been kind of waffling between a 7.5 and an 8, and before the ending of the movie happened, I was like, yeah, this is like a 7.5. It's good, but it's a little flabby. And then the scene with Dobby happened, and I was like a puddle, and I was like, shit, like this this is really well made. I'm gonna come out in an 8 out of 10, and I could be swayed one way or another on that, but that's where I'm landing now, Brad.
Bob, I think that for me, this is probably my second or third favorite of the whole franchise. I've always really, really liked it. I just remember walking away from that movie thinking, holy cow, that was beautiful. And it was different than anything I'd seen before in the Harry Potter universe. So for me, I would put this up there with Cuarón's entry, with the Half-Blood Prince. I'm going to give it a 9 out of 10.
Wow.
I really, really, really enjoyed it. And this is probably my third, maybe fourth time watching it. And I will say, it has only gotten better with time for me. So I'll give it a 9 out of 10. It's not a perfect movie. I would probably say that the sixth one is still my favorite. But this is up there, man. I like it a lot.
All right, there you have it. Brad gives it a 9 out of 10. I gave it an 8 for an average of an 8.5, but we'd like to know what you think of this movie. Is it the best of all Harry Potters? Is it the worst of all Harry Potters? You can get at us on our social media accounts on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram at Film Whiskey.
Or if you really want to communicate with us personally, one-on-one, Bob and I spend tons of time on our Discord. If you've never heard of Discord before, it is literally just a platform where we can communicate through text. We can jump on to a voice chat together. There's all sorts of options to hang out with us, talk movies, talk whiskey, talk sports, and we do it all over there, Bob. So check it out. You can find a link to our Discord in the show notes. You can download it on your phone, on your computer. But yeah, we'd love to chat with you guys there.
And if you're feeling especially generous, you can become a Patreon patron. We have 3 tiers that you can subscribe at, $3, $5, and $7 per month. You get perks like exclusive Discord access to a patron-only account. You get early episodes. You get NSFW episodes of Film and Whiskey. All these bleeps are gone on the Patreon. So please consider joining us at patreon.com/filmwhiskey. Next week, we are going to look at Brad's first film for season 5. As you guys know, we've picked 15 movies apiece just to kind of shoot the breeze about. For the most part, we're going to be doing them in random order, but next week we have a very special guest. YouTuber and filmmaker Patrick H. Willems is going to be joining us for the 1963 classic Charade. Brad, I cannot wait for that episode, man.
Dude, I'm like bouncing in my chair right now, man. I am so jazzed.
Well, we'll see you next week for Charade, but until then, I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And we'll see you next time.